The candidates did not go as well for Alireza Firouzja as many of us hoped that it would. At its conclusion, he was in sixth place out of eight, half a game behind Fabiano Caruana. But he really, in the interviews following the tournament, had a very sober view. He's very objective. He never blames anybody else. He always takes full responsibility for everything, and he's ready to get back into chess. He's going to be playing another tournament here very soon. And he finished the tournament strong. He finishes as the fourth highest rated player in the world, only down one spot. So let's jump in. This is his game against Fabiano Caruana. Firouzja has the black pieces. Caruana has the white pieces. Caruana begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, knight f6, the Berlin defense, and Caruana chooses to play d3, avoiding the complex Berlin endgame. Bishop to c5, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. This gives black the two bishop advantage, but does weaken the pawn structure, doubling the c pawns. The pawn at e5 is vulnerable. It cannot be captured immediately, however, because black plays queen to d4, threatening mate on f2 and hitting the knight at e5. So knight b to d2, knight to d7 to defend the pawn, castles, castles, knight to c4. One of white's key ideas here is to put as much pressure on e5 as possible. It's also common to play b3 and bishop to b2 to hit that pawn. f6 defends the pawn. King to h1 moves out of the pin of the bishop at c5 because white's main pawn break here is going to be pawn to f4. So in order to move that pawn, he has to move the king. Rook to f7 clears the f8 square for a bishop or a knight. Also, the rook can move to d7 later. Knight to h4, aiming for f5, but also clearing the way for the f pawn to move. Bishop to f8, knight to f5, knight to c5. The knight can come to e6, where it's quite flexible. Go to f4 or d4. Queen to h5. Now, at first, this looks like this walks into a fork with g6, but after knight to e6 check, bishop takes, queen takes, there is no fork. So bishop to e6 is played instead. Now b3 helps to support the knight. Also, the bishop could go here later if he wants to, but since he's breaking on f4, he probably wants to keep the bishop on its current diagonal. Queen to d7, bishop to e3, puts pressure on this knight, which is only defended by the bishop at f8. King to h8, and now he is threatening the g6 fork because knight to h6 would not be a check. So Caruana plays knight to h4, and here he's threatening to win a piece. He's threatening to play knight to g6 check. The knight cannot be taken because the pawn at h7 is pinned. And when the king moves over, he plays knight takes bishop. The knight would hit the queen, so it would have to be recaptured, and then the knight at c5 would hang. So knight to g6 threatens to win a piece by taking the bishop and then capturing the knight, which would no longer be defended. So Firouzja plays the king back to g8 to avoid that. Queen to e2, rook to e8, now a4, gaining space and helping to control the b5 square. b6, creating some flexibility in those queenside pawns. He wants to play a5. Rook to g1, flirting with the idea of g4. He never actually follows through with it, but I guess the idea is he wants to play g4, maybe knight to f5, although it never actually happens. Firouzja plays a5. White plays knight to d2. Now, up to this point, Firouzja is doing fine, but it's hard to find a plan in this position for black. And here Firouzja does something that he had done the entire tournament. He lashes out a bit. He plays a pawn move or a pawn break that opens up lines and gives him some potential for attack, but actually creates more weaknesses than it's really worth. And here he does that again. Remember the g4 move he played against Nepomniachtchi, for example. Here he plays the move f5. It does open up lines, but it really creates too many weaknesses here. And now Caruana has a combination that guarantees him, for the moment anyway, a superior minor piece. Do you see the combination that Caruana can play here? That's right. He takes on f5. Then after bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, queen takes f5, and now bishop takes c5. And after bishop takes c5, knight goes to e4. And the knight on e4 is superior to the bishop. It's true there are pawns on both sides of the board, and that tends to favor the bishop. But the knight is on a weak square. It's unassailable. No pawn can eject the knight from this square, and the bishop cannot capture the knight. The only way to get rid of it would be to actually capture it with a rook. So the knight is stronger than the bishop for now. The Caruana ends up ruining this nice setup that he has as the game progresses. Firouzja plays bishop to b4. The rook goes back to f1. He never did advance the g-pawn. f2 is a little vulnerable, wants to defend it. Queen to g6, rook a to d1 with the idea of d4. But the d3 pawn helps support this knight, so playing d4 makes the knight a little less stable. h5, Firouzja wants to open up lines against Caruana's king. g3, again, the idea, I think, is that when the pawn comes, he'll take it and, he'll take it and open up the G file, but that's a lot of weaknesses. Rook f8, hitting f2, d4, pawn takes, rook takes, now h4, and h4. So Caruana has these 3 pawn weaknesses, and his king is a little bit less safe, but he does have the open G file as some compensation. But even more concerning is the knight on e4. Remember, that knight was on a very nice, very comfortable square. Now it's not. Now it's just sort of hovering in the air, and a move like f3 would just create more weaknesses. So Caruana sort of, I think he spoiled a little bit his nice minor piece situation. Rook to f4, queen to c4 check, king to h8, now knight to g5, sort of hovering around black's king. b5 hits the queen goes to d3, offering the exchange of queens. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen. Pawn takes a4, pawn takes a4, and now the bishop is probably superior to the knight. It looks like Firouzja now has the better minor piece instead of the worst minor piece, such as he had earlier in the game. The bishop moves back to d6, and we see Firouzja has very active pieces now. He's threatening rook takes a4, he's threatening rook takes h4 with further threats against the h2 pawn. Firouzja has a good position. Rook to c3 hits the c6 pawn, but allows rook takes a4. Now Firouzja has this really nice a4 pawn, which is very important in the rest of the game. Rook takes c6 and rook takes h4, threatening rook takes h2 check. And to prevent that, Caruana plays f4, gives up a pawn to block the bishop's access to the h2 square, but computers show us that the better move for white is probably rook to a6, dealing with this a4 pawn and just allowing black to take on h2 and just moving the king to g1, because the a4 pawn is the real problem here. But he plays f4, rook takes, bishop takes, knight to e4. So in this position, the a pawn plus the superior minor piece gives black the better endgame, but it's not like it's decisive. He still has to work very hard to win this endgame. Rook to a8 to get rooks belong behind passed pawns, as we know. Rook to c4, bishop to e5, rook to a4 to keep that pawn from going any further. Now the kings begin to centralize into the game. Knight to d2, bishop to c3 defends the a5 pawn. Knight to e4, bishop to b4, king f3, king e6, c3. Wants to push the bishop away from the defense of the a5 pawn. The bishop goes to e7, king to e3, and now he plays c6, which looks like a strange move at first, but what Firouzja wants to do is clear the way for the bishop at d8 to defend the a5 pawn, and then maybe his rook can become mobile again. h3, bishop to d8, defending the pawn, knight to c5 check, king to f5, knight to b3. So now both of these pieces are attacking a5, bishop to b6 check, king f3, king e5, h4, king to d5, h5, and c5. He would like to advance here and kick that knight from its nice post. The knight goes to d2 to help keep c4 under control. The bishop goes to c7, the king to e2, and now rook to h8. He can now move that rook because this bishop defends a5. The rook goes to g4, counterattacking g7, rook h5, rook g7, king c6. He knows that Firouzja knows his entire chance in the endgame revolves around being able to advance this pawn. The king moves around to defend it. King to d3, bishop to e5. This is definitely the best diagonal for this bishop. Mainly, you like to control this potential queening square at a1. rook to f7, a4. So up to this point, Caruana has defended very well. And this probably is still a holdable position for White. May still be able to hold a draw here, but he has to play very accurate chess. A move like knight to f3 would keep Caruana very much in the game, and it would still be a very hard win for Firouzja to realize. But he plays the move, Caruana plays the move, knight to e4 instead. And it turns out that this is a blunder that costs him the endgame. And very quickly, Firouzja strikes and wins this position. The move he plays here is this: rook to h3 check. And what he's trying to do is push the king away so his own king can become dominant, and then push the knight away from the defense of the c3 pawn. If the king goes to c4, which is what he would like to do, then rook to h4 pins the knight to the king. The king would have to come back to d3 to defend the knight, but then c4 check. Again, trying to push the king away from the knight. King e3, then rook to h3 check. King e2, king to d5, attacking the knight that defends the pawn at c3 when the knight moves, attacking the rook checks, king up, and bishop takes c3. And this would be a winning position for black with the two pawns on the a and the c file. So instead of king to c4, Caruana plays king to d2, but then king to d5, hitting the knight that defends c3. The knight goes to f2, hitting the rook at h3, but so the rook just takes at c3. He could have taken with the bishop too because it would have been check. Really doesn't matter. Rook to f5 does pin the bishop, and there is a little threat here of knight to g4, taking, the pinned bishop. But Firouzja plays rook to g3, controlling the g4 square. With the a and the c pawns, the game is decided, and in this position, Caruana resigned. Caruana did not have a very good second half of the tournament. So this game is really a very clear microcosm of Firouzja's play in this tournament. He played well in general, except in a few key games, he simply broke out or made an aggressive attacking move before the position was ready for it. A couple of times that worked for him. More often than not, though, it didn't. But he's going to dust himself off. He's playing in another tournament here very quickly. I think that's a good idea. Just get right back to playing. And I'm looking forward to him continuing to play good, strong chess. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.